She was sitting in seat 8B, reading a book, completely at peace. Nobody on that plane knew that a ground crew in Denver had put the wrong fuel in the aircraft. Fuel that was dirty. Fuel that was cheap to ignore. And 41 minutes into the flight, both engines went silent. Every single person on board felt it. But nobody knew what to do. Almost nobody. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The woman in seat 8B was reading a paperback. That is the first thing I noticed about her, not her face, not her clothes, but the book, because it was the kind of book that has been read before. The spine was cracked in 3 places. The top right corner of the cover was bent down and then bent back up and bent down again so many times that the cardboard had gone soft and pale. She had a pen tucked between 2 pages near the middle, but she was reading near the end, which told me she had already read it once and was now reading it again for a different reason. I don't know why I looked that closely. I always look too closely at strangers on planes. It is a bad habit that has never helped me in any way. She also had a cup of tea on her tray table. The tea had gone cold, you could tell because the steam had stopped, and the surface of the liquid had gone flat and still, the way liquids go when nobody is paying attention to them anymore. She was not paying attention to it. She was paying attention to her book with the kind of quiet focus that is almost rude, not because she was ignoring anyone but because she was so completely not needing anyone that it felt like a small rejection of the entire world around her. I found this slightly annoying. I could not have told you why. I was tired and I did not want to go to Albuquerque, and she looked like someone who had exactly nowhere she would rather not be, and that bothered me in the specific way that other people's peace bothers you when you do not have any of your own. The flight was operated by Mesa Sky Regional, a carrier I had flown twice before without incident or memory. It was an Embraer E190, a slim, quiet jet with 2 engines and 90 seats, the kind of aircraft designed for short routes that do not need anything bigger. Denver to Albuquerque is less than an hour. It is the kind of flight where people do not bother taking off their coats, where the flight attendants barely have time to finish the drink service before they have to collect the cups again. There were 87 of us on board. The sun was coming in low and orange through the windows on the right side of the plane, the late afternoon light that makes everything look a little warmer and a little more final than it actually is. I was going to a conference. A work conference, the kind where people stand in hotel lobbies with lanyards around their necks and say things like, "Let's connect," and mean nothing by it. I had packed 2 blazers and a laptop and a growing sense of resentment that I was not yet ready to fully examine. The woman in 8B had boarded with nothing but a small canvas bag and her paperback novel. She had put the bag in the overhead bin without struggling with it, settled into her seat, opened her book, and had not looked up since. Not for the safety demonstration. Not for the engine starting. Not for takeoff, which on this particular afternoon had been smooth and clean, the aircraft lifting off runway 25 at Denver International with the relaxed confidence of something that has done this 10,000 times. Around me, the other passengers arranged themselves into the ordinary geometry of a short regional flight. 2 rows ahead, a young couple was sharing a single set of earphones connected to a phone balanced on the man's knee, both of them leaning toward the middle of their seats. Across the aisle and a few rows back, a group of nurses in blue scrubs, 4 of them, maybe 5, were having a conversation that kept breaking into laughter, the easy laughter of people who work hard together and have learned to be loud in the gaps between hard moments. An elderly man in the window seat ahead of me had a folded newspaper crossword balanced on his tray table and was filling it in with the focused, unhurried movements of someone who has the right pen and knows it. And there was a child, a little girl, maybe 4 years old, in the seat directly in front of mine, who kept turning around to look at me over the seat back with large, serious eyes, no expression, just looking, the way only small children and cats will stare at you without embarrassment. Her mother, beside her, was asleep with a neck pillow and did not notice. I made a face at the child once. She did not react. She just kept looking. It was 41 minutes into the flight when everything changed. I know the exact number because I looked at my watch later, trying to reconstruct it, and 41 minutes is what I came to. At 41 minutes we were at 28,000 feet, over the high desert of northern New Mexico, the land below looking brown and flat and enormous in the way that land only looks from very high up. The afternoon light was still coming in from the right. My cup of coffee was on my tray table. The child in the seat in front had finally stopped staring at me and had turned forward again. The engine stopped. I want to be careful about how I describe this because the word stopped is not quite right and died is too dramatic, and neither of them captures the specific quality of what happened, which was this: the sound that I had not been consciously listening to, the deep continuous hum and push of two turbofan engines doing what turbofan engines do, simply was not there anymore. It did not cut out with a bang. It did not sputter or cough or wind down slowly. One moment it was present, as invisible and unremarkable as the air in the cabin, and the next moment it was absent, and the absence was so complete and so wrong that my body understood it before my brain did. I felt it in my chest, not a sound but the removal of a sound, a silence with weight to it, with texture, the kind of silence that is not peaceful at all but is instead the silence of something that has gone wrong in a way that does not have a name yet. For about 3 seconds, nobody moved. I think we all did the same thing, which was to sit very still and wait for the sound to come back, the way you wait when a light flickers, certain it is about to steady itself. It did not come back. The cabin was quiet in a way that a cabin at 28,000 feet should never, ever be quiet. And then, very slowly, the aircraft began to descend. Not fall, I want to be clear about that, because fall suggests speed and chaos, and this was neither. It was a descent, a long, tilting, patient descent, the way a piece of paper falls when you let it go from your hand, drifting down with its own particular grace. A glider. We had become a glider. I did not know that yet. I just knew that the nose of the aircraft had tilted down slightly and the rate of descent was wrong and the engines were still not making any sound at all. My coffee cup went completely still. I had not noticed it moving before, but it had been vibrating, a tiny constant tremor against the plastic tray table that was the physical signature of two engines running a few dozen feet away, and now that tremor was gone and the coffee was as still as the woman's cold tea. I stared at it. The light through the right side window seemed suddenly too sharp, too clear, the kind of clarity you only notice when something has changed that you cannot yet name. My ears registered a small change in pressure. Not dramatic. Just a quiet shift, like the beginning of something. I looked at the flight attendants. There were 3 of them working this flight. The lead flight attendant, a man in his 40s with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who has been doing this long enough to have seen most things, was standing in the forward galley when the engine stopped, and I watched his face do something that I will not forget. It was not panic. It was not even fear, exactly. It was something much more controlled than fear, and that was somehow worse, because panic is uncontrolled and therefore human and reassuring in its own way, but what crossed his face was the expression of a person who has just received information and is immediately and completely focused on what to do with it. He moved to the cockpit door and knocked and was admitted within 5 seconds. The other 2 flight attendants, a younger woman and another man, looked at each other for a moment, just a moment, and then began moving through the cabin with the careful, deliberate calm of people who are trained for exactly this and are using every bit of that training right now. They were not running. They were not calm, either. They were something in between that has a specific name in emergency training and no name at all in ordinary life. Nobody announced anything yet. The passengers had noticed. The silence was too complete for anyone not to notice. But there is a particular human talent for convincing yourself that what is wrong is not wrong, especially on aircraft, especially when the people in uniform are still moving calmly and nobody has said the word emergency out loud. I watched the people around me doing this, the small, unconscious project of persuading themselves that it was nothing, a routine power reduction, a mechanical quirk, something pilots do on purpose for reasons passengers don't need to understand. The young couple in front had stopped leaning toward each other. The nurses had gone quiet. The elderly man with the crossword had not looked up yet, but his pen had stopped moving. The child in the seat directly in front of me was asleep. I do not know when she fell asleep. She was just suddenly asleep, her head tilted against her mother's arm, and her mother was awake now and gripping the armrest and staring at the back of the seat in front of her with the still, contained expression of a person who is managing something very large inside a very small amount of space. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was what was happening on the other side of the cockpit door. Captain Elena Soares had been flying for 24 years. She had logged time on 6 aircraft types, had flown through ice storms over the Rockies and microbursts over Dallas and a hydraulic anomaly over Phoenix that she had resolved without the passengers knowing anything had happened. She was 51 years old and she was, by any measure, exactly the person you want sitting in the left seat of an aircraft that is in trouble. What she did not have, on this particular afternoon, was her first officer. His name was Daniel Park, and 30 minutes into the flight he had eaten something, a meal he had brought from the Denver terminal, a wrapped sandwich from a cafe he had eaten at before without incident, and within 10 minutes his throat had begun to close. A severe allergic reaction, triggered by something in the food, an ingredient not listed or cross-contaminated, the kind of event that is medically serious and practically impossible to predict. He had told Captain Soares before losing consciousness, had managed to make sure the aircraft was stable and the autopilot was set, and had been helped to the rear galley by the lead flight attendant, where 2 of the nurses, who were, it turned out, ER nurses from a hospital in Santa Fe, returning home from a conference of their own, were now keeping him alive with the emergency medical kit and the particular competence of people who spend their working lives managing crises in small spaces. Soares had been flying solo for 11 minutes when both engines failed. She had never experienced a real dual-engine flameout in 24 years of flying. She had experienced it in simulators, twice, years ago, as part of training exercises. In the simulator, you know it is coming. You are seated and ready and there are instructors nearby. In the real aircraft, at 28,000 feet, over the desert, with your first officer unconscious in the back and 87 passengers behind the door, the experience is different in a way that simulator training tries to prepare you for and cannot fully prepare you for. She did not panic. She did what she was trained to do, she declared an emergency on the radio, she ran the engine restart checklists, she began calculating glide ratio and distance, she pulled up the charts for Albuquerque International, 34 miles ahead. The numbers were close. Too close to be comfortable and not close enough to be impossible. She was attempting engine restarts, the procedure where you use airspeed to spin the engines and try to relight the fuel, but the relights were not catching, and she did not yet know why. 12 minutes after the engines died, the lead flight attendant came back into the cabin and made an announcement. His voice was steady. I will remember his voice for the rest of my life, the specific steadiness of it, because steadiness in that moment was not a natural state but an achieved one, something he was actively maintaining, and maintaining it for us, for all 87 of us, was an act of profound professional care. He said there was a technical situation the flight crew was working to resolve, that everyone should remain seated with seatbelts fastened, and that he wanted to ask whether any passenger had experience in aviation or aerospace engineering. He said it calmly. He said it clearly. He said it in the voice of someone who is asking because they need to know and not because the situation is beyond control. The woman in seat 8B put down her book. She did it the way you put down a book when you have reached a good stopping point, not urgently, not dramatically, just with a small, quiet decision. She placed it on the tray table with the cold tea. She sat still for exactly 1 moment. Then she pressed the call button. I watched this from seat 9A with the same helpless attention I had been directing at everything around me for the past 12 minutes. From where I sat I could see her profile. I had not really looked at her face before, only at her book, and now I saw that she was around 50, with short hair that had started going gray and had gone fully gray in places and had stopped going and started simply being gray, the way some people's hair does when it decides it is finished with the process. She had a calm face. Not serene. Calm is different from serene. Calm is something you maintain, serene is something you are, and what she had was maintained, a face organized around some central steadiness she had either been born with or had spent years arriving at. The flight attendant came to her immediately. She spoke to him quietly, too quietly for me to hear. His face changed. I watched it change. I could not name what it changed into. It was not relief and it was not alarm and it was not hope, exactly, but it had elements of all of those things, the expression of someone who has just been told something that alters the dimensions of the situation in a way they are still processing. Then he walked her to the cockpit. She walked up the aisle with her small canvas bag still in the overhead bin, her book left on the tray table, her cold tea still there. She knocked on the cockpit door herself. It opened. She went in. The door closed behind her. I would not learn who she was until 3 weeks later, and I would learn it from a government report, not from her, because she was not the kind of person who explained herself in airports. Her name was Dr. Priya Anand. She had spent 19 years as a propulsion systems engineer at Rolls-Royce, not the car company, the engine company, the one that builds the turbofan engines that power a significant portion of the world's commercial aircraft. She had spent those years working specifically on high-altitude engine behavior, on the conditions under which turbofan engines fail to perform as designed, on the chemistry and physics of combustion at altitude where the air is thin and cold and unforgiving. After Rolls-Royce she had moved to a university, where she taught and wrote papers, 19 papers, I counted them later, on things like turbofan combustion dynamics, fuel system contamination effects, high-altitude relight envelopes. She had written sections of the technical manuals that pilots study when they train for exactly the kind of emergency that was currently happening to this aircraft. She had spent her career inside the mathematics of engine failure. She could not fly a plane. She had never flown a plane. But she knew, with the specific and comprehensive knowledge of someone who has spent 2 decades studying the inside of turbofan engines, exactly what was happening to the engines on this aircraft and, possibly, why. She had booked this particular flight because her sister lived in Albuquerque and she visited twice a year and she always took the late afternoon departure because she liked the light. That is the whole reason. She was on this aircraft because she liked the quality of the afternoon light over the desert. I pieced together what happened in the cockpit from the NTSB report and from the things Priya said in the one interview she gave, 7 weeks after the incident, in which she described the events with the same precision and emotional flatness you would use to describe a laboratory procedure. She walked into the cockpit and she did not look at the captain first. She looked at the engine instruments. Captain Soares, who later said she was aware that the passenger being brought forward was a propulsion engineer and had decided to give her 30 seconds to look and assess before explaining the situation, said that Priya spent approximately 10 seconds looking at the instrument panel without speaking. Then she asked one question: what altitude had the flameout occurred, and what was the current fuel temperature reading? Soares told her. Priya was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said this, and this is close to her exact words from the CVR transcript, the cockpit voice recording, which the NTSB later released in its summary: the relight attempts had been failing because the fuel temperature had dropped below the combustion threshold. The contaminated fuel, and here she paused, because she was inferring contamination from the instrument readings and the failure mode, not from knowledge of what had actually happened on the ground in Denver, had a lower flash point than standard jet fuel, which meant that at high altitude, where temperatures were already extreme, the fuel was too cold to ignite reliably. The engines had not failed because of a mechanical problem. They had failed because the fuel would not burn. And the relight attempts were not catching because they were attempting ignition at an altitude where the temperature differential between the fuel and the surrounding air made combustion almost impossible. She said there was a procedure, a windmill relight, where the airspeed of the descending aircraft spins the engine turbines fast enough to create ignition conditions, but that it had a better chance of working at a lower altitude, around 12,000 feet, where the temperature was higher and the combustion conditions were more forgiving. The problem was getting there. To reach 12,000 feet from 28,000 feet while maintaining enough horizontal distance to still make Albuquerque, they would need to descend faster than Captain Soares was currently descending. Not so fast as to be dangerous, but fast enough that it would be felt in the cabin. And if the relight did not work at 12,000 feet, they would not have enough altitude left to reach the airport, which meant landing in the desert, which meant an unpowered landing on terrain that was not designed for it, which meant, she did not say this part, but the logic of it was present in the air of the cockpit, a very different kind of outcome. Captain Soares asked 2 questions. The first was about the specific descent rate required and whether it fell within the aircraft's glide parameters. The second was about what to expect from the engines during the relight attempt, what the instruments would show, what sounds to listen for, what signs would tell her it was working versus what signs would tell her it was not. Priya answered both questions precisely and completely. Then she stopped talking, because she had said everything she knew and everything she had said was accurate, and now it was not her decision. It was never her decision. She was not the captain. She had never been the captain. Captain Elena Soares was the captain, and the captain would decide, and whatever the captain decided, Priya Anand would support. Soares made the decision to increase the descent rate. She adjusted the controls. The nose of the aircraft tilted down a degree or 2 more than it had been. In the cabin, we felt it immediately. The angle was wrong in a way that made your stomach register before your brain did, the specific wrongness of a descent that is steeper than the gentle controlled descents you are used to feeling on approach to an airport. It was not violent. It was not terrifying in any cinematic sense. It was just wrong, persistently, undeniably wrong, and the silence of the engines remained absolute, and the desert was coming up below us at a rate that, if you watched the ground, you could see was too fast, and the people around me had given up the project of convincing themselves that nothing was wrong. The nurses in the back were still working on the first officer. I could not see them from my seat, but I knew it because earlier I had watched 2 of them move up the aisle to get items from the forward emergency kit, and I had seen their faces, which were the faces of people entirely absorbed in a clinical task, present and focused and stripped of everything except the work. Whatever they were doing back there, they were doing it competently, and that was its own kind of courage, not the dramatic courage of movies but the quiet courage of people doing their jobs under conditions that would have made many people stop being able to do their jobs. The flight attendants were walking the cabin slowly, stopping at each row, speaking quietly to passengers, answering questions with the specific, honest vagueness of people who are not lying but are also not going to say out loud the thing that everyone already knows. They were checking seatbelts. They were asking if anyone needed water. They were, in some cases, placing a hand briefly on a shoulder. Simple things. Enormously important things. The lead attendant's voice, when he spoke to the passenger ahead of me, was unhurried and low, and I did not hear what he said, but the passenger, a woman in her 60s who had been gripping the armrests, visibly loosened her grip afterward. He walked to the next row. He did the same thing. He was doing this for all 87 of us, one at a time, with the same careful attention, which means he was doing it for all 87 of us, one at a time, while also knowing everything that I did not know about the condition of this aircraft. I think about that sometimes. I think about what that requires of a person. The young couple who had been sharing headphones were holding hands now. Both hands, all 4 of them, pressed together between their seats. Neither of them was looking at a phone or a screen. They were looking at each other, or they were looking at the seat back ahead of them, or they were looking at nothing, but they were doing it together in the particular way of people who have decided that the only useful thing right now is to be in contact with the person who matters most. The elderly man had folded his crossword and put it in his shirt pocket. He was looking out the window at the desert below. I watched him for a moment. He seemed, improbably, the calmest person in the cabin, with the exception of the child who was still asleep. I have thought about him since. I wonder if it is easier, when you are older, to sit with certain kinds of knowledge. I wonder if the years bring you something like acceptance that is not resignation but is just a longer view of things, a sense that the story does not belong to you alone and may not end when and how you expect, and that this is, ultimately, not a thing to rage against. I don't know. I was 34 years old and sitting in seat 9A, and I had stopped thinking about the conference in Albuquerque entirely. What I was thinking about was a specific afternoon from the previous summer. I had been sitting on the front steps of my apartment building doing nothing, no phone, no book, just sitting in the late afternoon warmth while the street went about its business. The quality of the light. The sound of a neighbor's radio through an open window 3 floors up. A dog somewhere that I never saw. I had not thought of that afternoon as important when it was happening. It was just an afternoon, ordinary and unannounced, the kind that passes without being noted. Sitting in 9A at an unknown altitude over the New Mexico desert, with both engines silent and the descent angle wrong, it seemed to me that that afternoon had been important in a way I had entirely failed to recognize while it was happening, and I wanted to go back to it with the knowledge I had now about the specific preciousness of unremarkable moments. I knew, even then, sitting there, that this was the kind of thought you have in an emergency and forget afterward when the ordinary has reasserted itself. I still forgot it afterward. I remembered it again later. I keep forgetting and remembering it. I think that might be all there is to say about that. At 11,400 feet, Engine 2 came back to life. The sound it made was, I do not have words for this that will do it justice. It was not dramatic. It was not a roar. It was a low, building hum, the specific frequency of a turbofan engine beginning to work again, starting from nothing and climbing through its operating range, and it filled the cabin the way warmth fills a cold room, gradually and then completely. I heard it before I understood what I was hearing. My body registered it before my brain formed the thought. And then the thought arrived, one engine. One engine is running. And the thought immediately behind it, crowding in before the first one was even finished, one is not two. 14 seconds. That is how long we waited for engine 1. I know because I counted, silently, not because I was calm enough to count but because counting was the only thing my nervous system could find to do with itself. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And then engine 1 came back, lower and rougher than engine 2 but unmistakably there, unmistakably running, and the aircraft had two engines again and they were both burning and the descent angle began to change and the nose began to come up, very slowly, very carefully, the way you handle something that has been through something. I did not cheer. Nobody cheered. I have thought about this since. In movies, people cheer, people cry, people embrace strangers, but in the actual moment the cabin was very quiet for a long time, because the sound of the engines returning did not immediately convince any of our bodies that it was over. We had spent long minutes learning that engines could stop without warning, and our bodies were not ready to simply believe that they could also start again without warning and that this time it would hold. I sat very still and breathed and felt my hands shaking against my thighs and did not try to stop them from shaking because that seemed like the honest response to what was happening and honesty felt important. The aircraft climbed. Gently, gradually, not rushing. It climbed the way something climbs when it has just barely made it and knows it and is being careful. Albuquerque came into view on the right side of the aircraft, the flat city grid and the strip of green along the Rio Grande and the Sandia Mountains beginning to go pink in the last of the afternoon light. I had driven through Albuquerque once, years ago, without stopping, and I had thought nothing of it. It looked, from up here, like the most beautiful city I had ever seen. The landing was unremarkable. This is the part of the story that people find hard to believe, but it is the truest part. Captain Elena Soares put that aircraft down on runway 26 at Albuquerque International Sunport with the same smooth, professional precision she had used on 10,000 previous landings, the wheels touching at the right speed and the right angle, the thrust reversers engaging, the aircraft slowing and turning off the runway onto the taxiway where the emergency vehicles were waiting, the fire trucks and the medical vehicles and the flashing lights in the early evening, and rolling to a stop at the gate without drama. The flight attendant on the PA said something. I was listening and I cannot remember a word of it. I know he said it well. I could tell from his voice, which was still steady, still clear, and which now had something in it that had not been there before, something warmer and more human than the controlled professional calm, something that was the voice trying not to be too much and almost failing. People stood up and opened the overhead bins and retrieved their bags. They did this with the slightly dazed, slow movements of people whose bodies had not yet fully received the news that things were normal again. Nobody spoke much. The nurses in the back were still with the first officer, who was breathing and conscious and had been talking for the last 10 minutes, and two paramedics boarded the aircraft almost immediately and took over with the efficient speed of people who know exactly what to do and have done it many times. The other passengers moved around them and through the cabin and out the door. The woman from 8B was one of the last to leave. She had retrieved her canvas bag from the overhead bin. She had her book under her arm. She paused at the door of the aircraft and said something to the lead flight attendant, just a few words, quietly, the way you say something when you have been through something together and there is nothing adequate to say and you say something small instead because small is all that will fit. The flight attendant covered his mouth with his hand briefly. He was not crying. He was holding something. Then Priya walked off the aircraft and through the jetway, and I was a few people behind her, and I watched her walk. At the gate, a woman was waiting. Younger than Priya by maybe 10 years, with the same build and the particular resemblance of people who share a family, who have looked at the same face from across the dinner table for a lifetime. She saw Priya and she came forward quickly and put her arms around her sister, and Priya put her arms around her sister, and they stayed like that for a moment that I was not supposed to witness and witnessed anyway because I could not stop watching. Then they separated and the younger sister said something and Priya said something back, and whatever Priya said, her sister laughed, a short, startled, genuine laugh, and then they walked away into the terminal together, Priya with her bag over one shoulder and her book under her arm, the two of them ordinary and small among the people moving through the airport in the early evening, and then they were gone. I stood at the gate for a while. I don't know how long. The gate area was emptying out, the other passengers dispersing, the emergency vehicles visible through the window pulling away from the aircraft. There was no particular reason to stand there. I did not know why I was standing there. I just was not ready to walk away yet, and so I stood there, in the specific way you stand somewhere when the somewhere has just become different from what it was when you arrived in it, when you are not sure yet what to do with everything that has just happened to you. 3 weeks later I found the NTSB preliminary incident report online. It described the contaminated fuel, a ground crew error at Denver International, a fuel truck that had contained residual water and microbial contamination from improper maintenance of the storage tank. The contamination had been identified in an internal audit 3 months before the incident. The audit had recommended taking the fuel truck out of service for cleaning and inspection. The recommendation had been noted and set aside because removing the truck from service during a period of high operational demand would affect turnaround times, and someone had decided the risk could be managed for a while longer, and they had managed it for 3 months and then it had stopped being managed and 87 people had descended toward the desert at 11,000 feet with no engine noise in a silent aircraft. The report named Dr. Priya Anand in the section on crew resource management and passenger assistance. It described her credentials and her role in the cockpit in the flat, neutral language of official government documents, which managed nonetheless to convey something important, that a passenger with specific expertise, at a specific moment, had provided the flight crew with information that was relevant to the outcome. It did not say she saved the aircraft. Government reports do not say things like that. What it said, in its careful language, was that the information she provided was consistent with the subsequent successful relight procedure. I read that sentence 4 times. I looked her up afterward. Her faculty page at the university had a photograph. She was standing in front of a lecture hall whiteboard, looking slightly impatient, the expression of someone who has explained a complicated concept many times and is prepared to explain it again and is not annoyed by this, exactly, but is also not pretending it is fresh. She looked, in that photograph, exactly like a woman reading a paperback novel on a flight to visit her sister. She looked like someone you would not look at twice in an airport. She looked like background. She looked like the kind of person who is carrying an entire world inside them that you will never see, 19 years of accumulated understanding about the inside of turbofan engines, about the chemistry of combustion, about the precise conditions under which fire either catches or does not catch, all of it present and invisible, carried quietly through boarding gates and security lines and airplane cabins, never announced. The conference in Albuquerque was fine. I remember almost none of it. 6 weeks after the flight, I was on another plane. A different route, a larger aircraft, a window seat somewhere in the middle of the cabin. The person in the seat directly ahead of me was reading a book, not a paperback, an e-reader, the small rectangular kind with the matte screen, but still, a person reading, absorbed, present inside whatever world the words had built around them. I looked at the back of their head for a moment. I thought about what I did not know about them. Their name. Their work. The thing they spent their years learning that I would never learn. The small bag in the overhead bin and what it meant about where they were going and why. The complete and total world of them, invisible, present, carried quietly in the seat ahead of mine. I did not know what to call what I felt looking at them. It was not fear. It was something quieter than fear. It was not exactly gratitude either, though gratitude was part of it. It was something more like recognition, the particular recognition that the ordinary world you move through is full of people who are full of things, learned and accumulated and carried, and that most of the time this is just the background of life, invisible and unremarkable, and that occasionally, rarely, in the specific circumstances that no one plans for and everyone hopes will never come, the ordinary afternoon depends on exactly that. On the right person being in the right seat. On someone who spent 19 years studying engine failure getting on an airplane because she likes the light. The flight took off. The engine sounded the way engines are supposed to sound. I closed my eyes and I listened to them for a long time. The ordinary afternoon, sometimes, depends on the world the person ahead of you is carrying, quietly, without announcement, all along.